Charlotte Hayes gripped the steering wheel of her sedan a little tighter as she turned onto the quiet, tree-lined street that led to her aunt's house, her mind still buzzing from the long shift she had just finished. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a golden glow over the neat suburban lawns and flower beds, a stark contrast to the tension simmering inside her chest. She had spent the last decade working as a trauma nurse, dealing with life-and-death situations daily, but nothing in the emergency room had prepared her for the slow, insidious battle she was now facing with the Homeowners Association. Her aunt, Eleanor Hayes, had lived in this community for almost 2 decades, a retired professor of law whose reputation extended far beyond the quiet streets of Fairview Oaks. She had been a fierce advocate for justice, a woman who had mentored generations of students and fought tirelessly for civil rights. But life had a cruel way of humbling even the strongest, and after a sudden stroke left her partially paralyzed last year, the once formidable Eleanor had been forced to adjust to a new reality, one where she was no longer as independent as she had once been. Charlotte had moved in soon after, unwilling to let the woman who had raised her face this alone. It had been Charlotte's idea to install the wheelchair ramp, a necessity given Eleanor's mobility issues, and she hadn't thought twice about it. In her mind, it wasn't a luxury, it was a fundamental right. But the HOA apparently disagreed. The first letter had arrived just a week after construction was completed, an impersonal notice citing a vague violation of community aesthetics. Charlotte had dismissed it as a formality, assuming that once she explained the medical necessity behind the modification, the issue would resolve itself. But then came the second letter, this one more aggressive, warning of increased HOA fees and potential fines if the ramp was not removed immediately. The third had been even more direct, an ultimatum. And now, as Charlotte pulled into the driveway, she saw the woman behind the letter standing on the porch, a clipboard in hand and a practiced, tight-lipped smile on her face. Susan Whitmore, HOA president, enforcer of arbitrary rules. Charlotte exhaled slowly, forcing down the frustration rising in her throat as she stepped out of the car. She was exhausted, her scrubs wrinkled, her mind still half stuck in the chaos of the hospital, but she wasn't about to let this woman intimidate her. "Miss Hayes," Susan greeted smoothly, though her gaze flickered with thinly veiled disapproval as she took in Charlotte's disheveled appearance. "I was hoping to catch you. I assume you've read our most recent notice." Charlotte crossed her arms, standing her ground. "I have," she said evenly, though her jaw tightened, "and I have no intention of removing that ramp." Susan let out a small, rehearsed sigh, the kind designed to sound sympathetic but carried no real warmth. "I understand that you have concerns, but Fairview Oaks has guidelines in place for a reason. We pride ourselves on maintaining a certain standard, and external modifications like—" She gestured vaguely at the ramp, her manicured nails flashing in the sunlight. "This, unfortunately, fall outside of those guidelines." Charlotte's patience was already running thin. "It's a wheelchair ramp," she said, her voice sharp. "It's not an eyesore. It's not a broken-down car on cinder blocks. It's something my aunt needs to live her life with dignity." Susan's smile didn't waver, but something in her expression hardened. "I sympathize with your situation, I do," she said, her tone bordering on condescending. "But the rules are the rules. We can't make exceptions for every single resident who decides they want to alter their home. Where would we draw the line?" Charlotte clenched her fists, resisting the urge to snap back. She knew this type, people who wielded power in petty ways, hiding behind bureaucracy while pretending to be reasonable. She had no patience for it. "My aunt is a retired professor of law," Charlotte said, her voice measured but firm. "She spent her career fighting for people's rights, and I can promise you that she's not about to back down over something as basic as accessibility. So, if you're here to try and intimidate us, you're wasting your time." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Susan's face. Hesitation, uncertainty, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same polished, rehearsed professionalism. "I would hate for this to escalate unnecessarily," she said, flipping through her clipboard. "But as it stands, your aunt's fees will be increased to reflect the unauthorized modification, and if the ramp is not removed by the end of the month, further action may be taken. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken with fury, but before she could respond, the front door opened, and Eleanor's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That won't be happening." Susan turned, startled, as Eleanor maneuvered her wheelchair onto the porch with practiced ease, her sharp eyes locking onto the HOA president like a hawk sizing up its prey. Even weakened by illness, there was a presence about her, an unshakable authority that couldn't be ignored. "This conversation is over," Eleanor said coolly, "and if you want to take this further, I suggest you consult a lawyer. Or perhaps I'll do it for you." Charlotte couldn't help the small, satisfied smile that tugged at her lips as she watched Susan falter, the first crack in her carefully composed demeanor appearing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time since this battle had begun, Charlotte felt something other than frustration. She felt ready. Charlotte sat at the small kitchen table, her fingers drumming absently against the worn wooden surface as she stared at the latest notice from the HOA. The words blurred together in her tired eyes: violation, increased fees, final warning, all wrapped in the sterile, impersonal language of bureaucracy. But the message was clear. They wanted the ramp gone, and they were determined to make Eleanor's life miserable until it was. The audacity of it sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through her veins. It wasn't enough that Eleanor had spent decades contributing to society, educating future generations, and fighting for justice. Now, in her most vulnerable years, she was being treated like an inconvenience. Eleanor sat across from her, sipping her tea with a practiced calm that Charlotte envied. There was a storm brewing, but her aunt remained unshaken, her sharp mind already 10 steps ahead, as it always had been. "You're fidgeting," Eleanor observed, raising an eyebrow. "That means you're thinking about doing something reckless." Charlotte exhaled through her nose, shaking her head. "I just don't get it. What kind of people go out of their way to harass a disabled woman over something as basic as a ramp? It's disgusting." Eleanor set her cup down with a soft clink. "People like Susan Whitmore don't see it that way. They see power, control. They don't care about what's fair, only what benefits them." Charlotte leaned back, rubbing her temples. Well, she picked the wrong people to mess with. The next morning, Charlotte decided to confront Susan directly. She arrived at the HOA office, a sleek, modern building that stood in stark contrast to the outdated policies it enforced. The lobby smelled of polished wood and artificial lavender, and the receptionist, a woman with a tight smile and an even tighter bun, barely looked up before directing Charlotte to Susan's office. Susan sat behind a pristine white desk, an expensive pen poised over a stack of documents, her expression one of mild impatience. "Miss Hayes," she said without looking up, "I assume you're here about the fees." Charlotte didn't bother sitting down. "That's one way to put it," she said, crossing her arms. "Let's cut to the chase. This is harassment. The ramp is a necessity, and increasing my aunt's fees over it is unethical, if not outright illegal." Susan finally looked up, her smile carefully measured. "We're simply enforcing community standards, Miss Hayes. Fairview Oaks has guidelines, and your modification violates them. The increased fees reflect the necessary adjustments to maintain property values." Charlotte let out a short, humorless laugh. "Property values? You're telling me that a wheelchair ramp is bringing down the neighborhood? That's the excuse you're going with?" Susan's expression didn't waver. "I don't make the rules. I enforce them." Charlotte took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You and I both know this isn't about a ramp. This is about power. You think you can bully people into compliance because most won't push back. But you've made a mistake this time." Susan leaned back in her chair, studying Charlotte as if she were a minor inconvenience. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it?" Charlotte met her gaze without hesitation. "I plan to find out exactly how deep this corruption goes." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked out, leaving Susan watching her with something that almost resembled amusement. But there was something else there too, a flicker of uncertainty. Charlotte spent the next week digging through HOA records, combing through every document she could get her hands on. The more she uncovered, the worse it got. Hidden fees, unexplained expenses, sudden fines imposed on homeowners for arbitrary reasons. It was a racket, a carefully constructed system designed to extract as much money as possible from the residents while offering nothing in return. And at the center of it all was Susan Whitmore. Charlotte could feel the pieces clicking into place, the truth forming into something undeniable. This wasn't just about a wheelchair ramp. It was about control, about greed, about a woman who had been given power and was using it to enrich herself at the expense of others. By the time she was done, she knew one thing for certain. Susan had spent years exploiting the people of Fairview Oaks, and now it was time for someone to stop her. Charlotte sat in her car outside the Fairview Oaks Community Center, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The weight of what she was about to do pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. But there was no turning back now. The folder of documents on the passenger seat contained everything she had uncovered over the past week. Misappropriated funds, fraudulent fines, and a pattern of discrimination that made her blood boil. She had debated the best course of action, whether to file an official complaint, take it straight to the courts, or expose it to the public. But deep down, she knew that nothing would shake this neighborhood awake quite like a scandal. And if Susan Whitmore thought she could intimidate her into silence, she was about to learn otherwise. With a deep breath, Charlotte grabbed the folder and stepped out into the warm afternoon air, her heels clicking against the pavement as she strode toward the building where the monthly HOA meeting was already underway. The room was packed, filled with homeowners who had no idea they were being systematically exploited. The board members sat at the front behind a long table, Susan at the center, her posture exuding authority as she coolly regarded the residents who had come to voice their complaints, most of which would be dismissed with polite condescension. Charlotte had no intention of letting that happen today. She waited just long enough for the meeting to settle into its usual rhythm of mundane updates before rising to her feet. "I'd like to address the board," she said, her voice carrying across the room. Heads turned, and Susan's eyes narrowed slightly as she gestured for Charlotte to step forward. "You may speak, Miss Hayes," Susan said smoothly, though her gaze was sharp, wary. Charlotte walked to the front, placing the folder on the table with deliberate care. "I've spent the past week reviewing the HOA's financial records, violation reports, and fee adjustments," she began, her tone steady despite the fury bubbling beneath the surface. "And what I found is deeply troubling. Over the past 5 years, this board has issued hundreds of fines that have no legal basis, increased fees arbitrarily, and used vague language in violation notices to intimidate residents into compliance." A murmur spread through the room. Susan remained impassive, but Charlotte saw the flicker of tension in her jaw. "Those are serious accusations," Susan said, folding her hands neatly on the table. "I trust you have evidence to support them?" Charlotte flipped open the folder, pulling out copies of bank transactions, internal emails, and breakdowns of fee distributions. "Here are records of HOA funds being funneled into private accounts, unexplained administrative costs that have tripled in the past 2 years, and multiple instances of residents being charged for non-existent infractions. This isn't just mismanagement, it's fraud." The murmuring turned into an uproar. Residents exchanged shocked glances, their anger growing with every page Charlotte revealed. A man in the back stood up. "Is this why my fees went up last year with no explanation?" A woman near the front clutched her copy of a violation notice. "They fined me for repainting my shutters the same color they've always been." Susan held up a hand, her expression carefully controlled. "I assure you, the HOA operates within the law. If there have been errors, we will investigate." Charlotte cut her off. "It's not an error. It's a deliberate scheme to exploit this community. And if you think you can dismiss this, you're mistaken. I've already sent this to a local news outlet. By tomorrow morning, everyone will know exactly what's been happening here." A ripple of shock passed through the board members. Susan's mask of composure finally cracked, just slightly. "That was a very reckless decision, Miss Hayes," she said, her voice quieter now, colder. "You don't understand the consequences of what you've done." Charlotte met her gaze without flinching. "Oh, I understand perfectly. You've spent years bullying people into silence. But you just picked a fight with the wrong person." Before Susan could respond, another voice cut through the chaos, one that carried authority far beyond anything the HOA president could muster. "That's enough." The room fell silent as Eleanor Carter wheeled herself forward. Though age and injury had taken their toll, there was still something formidable in the way she held herself, a presence that commanded respect without asking for it. She looked directly at Susan, her gaze unwavering. "I suggest you stop speaking before you dig yourself into a deeper hole." Susan's lips parted slightly, and for the first time, there was real recognition in her eyes, recognition and fear. Charlotte saw it happen in real time. The moment Susan realized exactly who she had been dealing with, Eleanor let the silence stretch just long enough to be effective before she spoke again. "I don't know if you understand the gravity of your situation, Ms. Whitmore, but I assure you, you will." Charlotte watched as Susan swallowed, her fingers twitching against the table. She wasn't in control anymore, and she knew it. The meeting dissolved into chaos, but Charlotte didn't care. The truth was out, and Susan Whitmore had just learned that some battles weren't worth picking. Charlotte stood outside the Fairview Oaks Community Center, watching as the final pieces of Susan Whitmore's carefully constructed empire crumbled. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns and pristine sidewalks that had once symbolized order and exclusivity, but now felt like a facade for something far more insidious. The news vans had arrived hours ago, their cameras trained on the front entrance where homeowners, once hesitant to speak, now eagerly shared their grievances. It was as if a dam had broken, years of frustration pouring out into the open. Inside, the meeting room was no longer a space for Susan's cold authority to reign. Instead, it was a battlefield where her power had been stripped away layer by layer. Charlotte had never been one to relish another's downfall, but as she watched Susan sitting stiffly behind the long table, surrounded by board members who were doing their best to distance themselves from her, she felt no sympathy. The once impeccable woman looked different now, her blazer slightly rumpled, her composed mask beginning to crack under the weight of reality. Eleanor Carter sat in the center of it all, her presence as commanding as ever despite the wheelchair that had once been used to justify stripping her of dignity. She was calm, methodical, wielding the law like a scalpel, cutting through every excuse, every feeble attempt at justification. The thick stack of documents in front of her was undeniable evidence. Financial discrepancies, fabricated violations, discriminatory practices. Every page was a nail in the coffin of Susan's reign. "This HOA has operated outside the bounds of the law for years," Eleanor said, her voice even, unwavering. "Not only have you imposed unlawful fees and targeted specific residents, but you have also engaged in fraudulent accounting practices that will not go unpunished." She turned a page, her sharp gaze flicking up to meet Susan's. "I have already spoken with legal authorities, and I can assure you, there will be consequences." The room was silent, save for the murmurs of the residents absorbing the full weight of what had just been said. Charlotte observed Susan closely, noting the subtle shift in her expression, the realization that she was not just losing control of this meeting, but of everything. One of the board members, a wiry man with thinning hair, cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitmore, perhaps it would be best if you—" "I will handle this," Susan snapped, though her voice lacked the sharpness it once carried. She turned to Eleanor, her composure barely holding. "These accusations are exaggerated. The HOA was simply enforcing community standards." Eleanor cut her off with a quiet but firm, "Spare me the justifications." She leaned forward slightly, her presence filling the space. "I have spent my life upholding the law, and I know corruption when I see it. The difference between you and me, Ms. Whitmore, is that I do not bend the law for my own gain." Charlotte felt a thrill of satisfaction at the way Susan's shoulders tensed, her fingers gripping the table's edge as if steadying herself. A new voice joined the conversation, one of the residents, an elderly man in the front row who had once been too intimidated to speak up. "So what happens now?" Eleanor let the question linger before answering. "Now, the residents take back control." The ripple of agreement that moved through the crowd was unmistakable. Susan, perhaps sensing that her position was no longer tenable, took a breath and straightened. If this community no longer wishes to follow my leadership, then I will step down. The words were meant to sound dignified, but they carried the weight of forced resignation. Another board member, seizing the opportunity for self-preservation, quickly added, "In light of recent revelations, I believe it would be best if the entire board resigns." That was it, the final act, the end of a regime built on intimidation and greed. By the time the meeting adjourned, Charlotte found herself back outside, breathing in the crisp evening air, letting the tension drain from her body. Eleanor wheeled up beside her, glancing at the commotion of departing residents, news reporters, and former board members who looked like they had just survived a public execution. "You did well," Eleanor said, her tone softer now. Charlotte smiled, exhaustion creeping in. "So did you," Eleanor hummed in response, looking out over the neighborhood she had fought to protect. "Justice isn't always about punishment," she said after a moment. "Sometimes, it's about making sure people like that never get the chance to do this again." Charlotte nodded, watching as Susan Whitmore walked to her car, her steps slower, her head slightly bowed. There was no gloating, no satisfaction in seeing her humiliated, just relief. As they turned to leave, a few residents approached, gratitude in their eyes, some offering quiet thank yous, others simply nodding in acknowledgement. The fear that had once kept them silent was gone, replaced by something else, something stronger. By tomorrow, Fairview Oaks would no longer be under Susan Whitmore's rule, and for the first time in years, it would truly belong to its residents.